Story number 1, Storm of No Return. We had all been looking forward to this cruise for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A week of sun, sand, and sea with my closest friends. We needed the break. Life had been wearing us down with work, relationships, and everything else piling on. This cruise was going to be our escape, a chance to reconnect and leave the stress behind. The first few days were everything we had hoped for. We drank, danced, and laughed like we hadn't in years. The ship was a floating city, and we explored every corner, from the endless buffet to the midnight pool parties. It felt like we had left the real world behind, lost in our own little paradise. But on the fourth night, something changed. We were far out at sea with no land in sight when a storm rolled in. The sky darkened quickly and the calm waters turned rough. The ship started to sway more than usual, and the once cheerful atmosphere grew tense. We all joked about it at first, convincing ourselves it was just a bit of bad weather. But deep down, I think we all felt it. That creeping sense of unease that comes when you realize you're completely at the mercy of something far bigger than yourself. We decided to stay up late, drinking in one of the lounges to take our minds off the storm. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like something alive. As the night wore on, the ship seemed to creak and groan more than usual, like it was struggling against the elements. We could barely hear each other over the noise, and a strange tension settled over us. The laughter that had been so easy before now felt forced. It was around midnight when the power flickered. The lights dimmed for just a second, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through all of us. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one said anything. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, more violent, and for the first time I felt truly scared. Then there was a loud bang, like something heavy had slammed into the side of the ship. The whole vessel shuddered and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound the relentless roar of the storm. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, and the panicked murmurs of my friends. We all stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the lights to come back on. When they did, the room looked different. The shadows seemed deeper, more menacing, and there was a strange smell in the air, something damp and metallic, like rust or blood. One of my friends suggested we head back to our cabins, and we all agreed, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The walk back was eerie. The ship's corridors were nearly deserted, and the occasional flickering light added to the unease. The ship felt different, less stable, as if it were struggling against something unseen. We clung to each other as we navigated the narrow hallways, trying to convince ourselves that everything was fine, that it was just a rough patch of weather. But as we turned a corner, we saw something that made us stop dead in our tracks. There, in the middle of the hallway, was water, ankle-deep, dark and murky. It wasn't just a little spill or a leak. It was as if the ocean itself was seeping into the ship. The water rippled slightly like something was moving beneath the surface, but there was no way that was possible. We were on the 10th deck, nowhere near the waterline. We all stood there, staring at the impossible scene in front of us, too scared to move. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. The storm was raging outside, but there was no reason for this much water to be inside the ship. One of my friends, braver than the rest of us, decided to step into the water. We all watched in horror as they waded through it, the murky liquid lapping against their legs. They stopped in the middle of the hallway, turning back to us with a look of confusion and fear on their face. And then they screamed. It was a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the empty corridor, a sound of pure terror. They scrambled back to us, nearly slipping in the water, their eyes wide with panic. "Something touched me," they gasped, their voice shaking. "Something's in the water." That was all it took for us to bolt. We ran as fast as we could, slipping and sliding through the hallways, our hearts pounding in our chests. The ship was a labyrinth, and in our panic we lost all sense of direction. Every hallway looked the same, every door identical. The lights continued to flicker, casting everything in a sickly, unnatural glow. We finally burst into a stairwell, gasping for breath. The water hadn't followed us, but the fear was still there, gnawing at us. We didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. We were trapped on that ship, miles from any land, with something we didn't understand. One of my friends suggested we find the crew, but we quickly realized that we hadn't seen any staff in hours. The ship felt deserted, like we were the only ones left. We huddled together in the stairwell, trying to come up with a plan. But the storm continued to rage outside, and the ship groaned and shuddered with every wave. Eventually, we decided to make our way to the main deck, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help us. The journey was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made us jump. The ship was no longer the safe, luxurious vessel we had boarded. It was something else now, something dangerous. When we finally reached the main deck, the storm had reached its peak. The wind howled like a banshee, and the rain pelted down in sheets. The ship was pitching violently, and we had to cling to the railings to stay upright. The deck was deserted, no crew in sight, just the angry ocean all around us. That's when we saw it. Out in the distance, barely visible through the rain and darkness, was a light, a small flickering light bobbing up and down with the waves. At first, we thought it might be another ship, maybe a rescue vessel, but as it got closer, we realized it wasn't a ship at all. It was a lifeboat, and it was empty. The sight of that empty lifeboat drifting aimlessly in the storm sent a chill down my spine. It was as if something was taunting us, showing us just how helpless we were. We watched in horror as the lifeboat drifted closer, then passed by the ship, carried away by the relentless waves. We knew then that we were on our own. Whatever was happening, whatever was out there, it was just us against it. We retreated back inside, locking ourselves in one of the lounges, too terrified to sleep. The storm raged on through the night, and the ship continued to groan and creak, but we stayed awake, huddled together, waiting for something to happen. Morning came, and with it, a strange, eerie calm. The storm had passed, and the ship was still, but the fear lingered. We ventured out, cautiously, hoping to find some explanation for what had happened the night before. The water in the hallway was gone, as if it had never been there. The crew reappeared, going about their duties as if nothing had happened. When we asked about the storm, they just shrugged, saying it was a rough night, but nothing unusual. There was no record of the lifeboat, no explanation for the water, nothing. We spent the rest of the cruise in a state of unease, unable to shake the feeling that something had changed. The ship felt different, like it was hiding something from us. We never spoke about what had happened, not really. We tried to move on, to enjoy the last few days of our vacation, but the fear lingered, a shadow over everything. When we finally disembarked, I was relieved to be back on solid ground, but the memories of that night stayed with me, haunting me in the quiet moments, when the world is still and the shadows grow long. I've tried to forget, to push it all to the back of my mind, but every now and then, I hear that faint whisper, feel the cold grip of fear, and I know that whatever happened on that ship will never truly leave me. Story number 2, Ghost Ship. I decided to treat myself to a vacation, a solo adventure on a luxurious cruise ship. It was supposed to be an escape from the monotony of my everyday life. The endless ocean, the exotic ports of call, and the promise of relaxation enticed me. I had saved up for this trip for years, and now I was finally here, ready to enjoy every moment. The first few days were blissful. The sun was warm, the food was delicious, and the sea was calm. I made a few acquaintances, chatted with the friendly crew, and even participated in some onboard activities. But on the fourth night, everything changed. It started with a strange feeling. I was lying in my cabin, the gentle rocking of the ship usually a lullaby, but that night it felt unsettling. My room seemed colder than usual, the air heavy and thick. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the sea breeze and maybe a hint of seasickness. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The sound came again, a heavy, deliberate thud, like someone was knocking on the walls of the ship. I sat up, my pulse quickening, and tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the ship's machinery, I told myself, or some rowdy guests playing a prank. But then I heard it. A faint whispering, almost imperceptible over the sound of the waves crashing against the hull. It was coming from the corridor outside my cabin. Curiosity and fear battled within me, but I had to know what it was. I got up, grabbed the flashlight I always kept by my bed, and crept to the door. The hallway was eerily empty, the only light coming from the dim emergency bulbs. I could still hear the whispering, but it seemed to be moving away from me. I followed the sound, my bare feet silent on the carpeted floor. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I couldn't understand the words. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. The ship groaned, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I turned a corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, shrouded in darkness. I aimed my flashlight at it, but the beam flickered and died. Panic surged through me as the figure began to move towards me, its steps slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from whatever was following me. I burst through a door and found myself in the engine room, the loud hum of the machinery filling my ears. The air was stiflingly hot, a stark contrast to the coldness of my cabin. I looked around, searching for an exit, but the door I had come through slammed shut with a deafening clang. Desperation clawed at me as I banged on the door, shouting for help. No one answered. The whispering returned, louder now, echoing off the metal walls. I could feel the presence of the figure behind me, its cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, my body trembling with fear. The figure was closer now, its features still obscured by shadows. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt a sudden searing pain in my chest. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my vision blurring. As I lay there, the figure loomed over me, its face finally coming into view. It was a grotesque, twisted version of a human face, its eyes empty sockets, its mouth a gaping maw. It leaned down, its breath rancid and cold, and whispered in my ear, "You should never have come here." Darkness engulfed me, and I felt myself slipping away, the terror and pain consuming me. The last thing I heard was the distant sound of the ship's horn, a mournful wail that seemed to echo through the void. When I woke up, I was back in my cabin, drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding, and my body ached. I scrambled out of bed, looking around frantically. Everything seemed normal, but the memory of that night haunted me. I avoided the lower decks for the rest of the trip, spending my days in the crowded areas, trying to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But the fear lingered, a constant, gnawing presence at the back of my mind. When the cruise finally ended, I couldn't disembark fast enough. Back home, I tried to forget, to push the memories of that night away. But every time I close my eyes, I see that figure, hear its whispers, and feel the cold, searing pain in my chest. I thought I was escaping my ordinary life, but now I can't escape the horror of that night. The cruise was supposed to be a dream vacation, but it turned into a nightmare that will haunt me forever. Story number 3, The Crimson Tide. I had always dreamed of taking a luxury cruise, and after years of saving, it was finally happening. My partner and I had booked a 2-week voyage through the Caribbean, a perfect escape from our busy lives. The ship was enormous, a floating city promising relaxation and adventure. We boarded with a mix of excitement and relief, ready to leave our worries behind. The first few days were everything we had hoped for. We lounged by the pool, enjoyed exquisite meals, and explored the various amenities the ship had to offer. It felt like a different world, far removed from the stresses of everyday life. But on the fifth night, everything changed. It started with an uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach during dinner. The air felt thicker, and the cheerful chatter of fellow passengers seemed muted. I brushed it off as seasickness or maybe just fatigue. After dinner, we decided to take a walk on the deck to enjoy the night breeze. As we strolled along the deserted deck, a thick fog began to roll in, enveloping the ship in an eerie mist. The sound of the ocean was muffled, and the usual twinkling of stars was obscured. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us feeling the strange, oppressive atmosphere. "Let's go back inside," I suggested, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. My partner nodded, and we turned to head back to our cabin. That's when we heard it, a faint, haunting melody, like a music box playing a distorted lullaby. It seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the ship. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to follow the sound. We navigated through the labyrinthine corridors, the melody growing louder and more distorted with each step. The ship felt different, as if it were alive, watching us with unseen eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of fear and fascination driving me forward. We finally reached a door marked "Crew Only." The music was definitely coming from behind it. My partner hesitated, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to see what was inside. I pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit staircase leading down into the bowels of the ship. "Are you sure about this?" my partner whispered, their voice trembling. "No," I admitted, "but we need to know what's going on." We descended the stairs, the temperature dropping with each step. The air grew damp and heavy, and the walls seemed to close in around us. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with doors. The music was louder now, almost unbearable, but it was clear which door it was coming from. I reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and cramped, filled with old, dusty furniture and cobwebs. In the center of the room sat an old gramophone, the source of the eerie melody. But what caught my attention was the figure standing beside it. It was a woman, or what was left of her. Her skin was pale and translucent, stretched tightly over her skeletal frame. Her eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She stared at us, her head cocked to one side as if studying us. We stood frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The woman slowly lifted her hand, pointing directly at me. Her mouth opened and she began to speak in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Help me," she whispered, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Please help me." I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and jumped, realizing it was my partner. They were as terrified as I was, their face pale and eyes wide with fear. We turned and ran, sprinting back up the stairs and through the maze of corridors until we burst back onto the deck. The fog was thicker now, and the ship felt like a ghostly apparition floating in a sea of darkness. We stumbled back to our cabin, locking the door behind us. Neither of us slept that night, haunted by the image of the woman and her chilling plea. The next morning, the ship's atmosphere was tense. Passengers whispered about strange occurrences, and the crew seemed on edge. We tried to report what we had seen, but our story was met with skepticism and brushed off as a prank or hallucination. The rest of the cruise was a nightmare. Every night, the haunting melody would start again, echoing through the halls. We avoided the lower decks, but the sense of dread never left us. The once luxurious ship had become a prison, and we counted down the days until we could disembark. When we finally docked, we were among the first to leave the ship. The relief of being back on solid ground was overwhelming, but the memories of that night still haunt us. I can't explain what we saw or heard, but I know it was real. We never spoke of it again, not to each other or anyone else. The experience left us with an unshakable fear, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. To this day, the sound of a music box sends shivers down my spine, and I can't help but wonder what became of that ghostly figure on the Crimson Tide.